12 months ago, the President of the United States looked at Canada and saw the easiest target in the world, a country with 75% of its exports going south. No military leverage, no nuclear weapons, no seat on the United Nations Security Council. A polite, predictable neighbor that had never, not once in the history of the relationship, seriously pushed back. He put 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, then 35, then 45. He called the Prime Minister the governor of the 51st state. He threatened to annex the country. He said the border between the two nations was a line drawn with a pen that could be erased with the same pen. And for a few weeks, it looked like he was right. Canada's economy contracted. Exports fell 16%. Jobs disappeared, not in the thousands, but in the tens of thousands. The auto sector, the backbone of Ontario's manufacturing economy, saw parts shipments delayed, orders cancelled, and factories running at reduced capacity. Canadian tourism to the United States dropped 40% in a single month. Canadian businesses that had spent decades building cross-border relationships watched those relationships evaporate overnight. The old Prime Minister resigned. The country was in shock. Not because of the tariffs themselves. Canada had weathered trade disputes before. But because of the language. 51st state, governor, a line drawn with a pen. For the first time in the modern history of the relationship, Canadians felt that their sovereignty was being questioned by the country they had considered their closest friend. And then something happened that nobody in Washington expected. Canada did not break. Canada adapted. And over the next 12 months, through a series of calculated moves, each one seemingly small, each one precisely timed, Canada systematically dismantled the most aggressive trade policy of the modern era, not with threats, not with military power, not with the kind of confrontation Washington understands, with strategy. This is the story of how a country with 1/10 the population and 1/14 the GDP took apart a superpower's trade agenda, piece by piece. It started with the election. In April 2025, Canadians went to the polls and elected a new Prime Minister, a former central banker who had run the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, a man who understood monetary policy, trade architecture, and financial systems at a level no other world leader could match. He won on a single promise. He would not let Canada be broken, and he won against the odds. In early January 2025, the Liberal Party trailed the Conservatives by more than 20 points in every poll. The trade war changed everything. Canadian nationalism surged. Anti-American sentiment, measured by polling, reached levels not seen since the Vietnam War. 91% of Canadians viewed the tariffs as unjustified. Canadian travel to the United States dropped 40%. And the party that promised to stand up, not back down, won enough seats to form a government. His first phone call with the president was described by both sides as cordial, but the substance was unmistakable. The new Prime Minister told the president that Canada would match every tariff with a retaliatory tariff, that Canada would not accept the framing of a national emergency, the legal basis for the tariffs under IEEPA, and that Canada would begin building alternative trade relationships immediately. Within weeks, the first moves began. Move 1, the Buy Canadian policy. The federal government redirected billions in procurement spending away from American suppliers and toward Canadian and allied manufacturers. This was not a vague pledge. It was a systematic restructuring of how the Canadian government spends money. Federal departments were instructed to review every contract with an American supplier and identify alternatives. Provincial governments followed within days, faster than anyone in Ottawa expected. Ontario cancelled a $100 million contract with an American satellite company. Nova Scotia doubled highway tolls for American commercial vehicles. Every province in the country pulled American alcohol from government-run liquor stores, a move that cost American distillers and wineries hundreds of millions in annual revenue overnight. The Northwest Territories halted all purchases of American goods through its Liquor and Cannabis Commission. Quebec estimated that tariffs alone could cost 100,000 jobs in the province, and responded by reviewing every procurement relationship with American firms. New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Yukon, even the smallest provinces allocated emergency funds to help businesses pivot away from American supply chains. These were not symbolic gestures. They were economic signals, designed to show American businesses that access to the Canadian market was no longer automatic, and they worked. American companies began lobbying their own representatives in Congress, not because they cared about Canadian sovereignty, because they were losing contracts. Move 2, trade diversification. In August 2025, the Prime Minister dropped most of Canada's retaliatory tariffs to match the CUSMA exemptions, a move critics called capitulation. It was not capitulation, it was positioning. By aligning with CUSMA, Canada preserved the framework that exempts the vast majority of bilateral trade from tariffs. 85% of goods continued flowing tariff-free. And, simultaneously, Canada accelerated negotiations with every other major trading bloc on Earth. The European Union, where Canada already has CETA, a comprehensive trade agreement that gives Canadian companies preferential access to 500 million consumers. India, the world's most populous country, growing at 7% per year, hungry for agricultural commodities that Canada produces in abundance. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10 countries, 700 million people, the fastest growing consumer market in the world. Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, South America's largest trading bloc, and China. The Prime Minister said publicly that Canada would not wait for the world it wished to be. It would take on the world as it is. That sentence, delivered at Davos in January 2026, became the defining line of the entire trade conflict. Move 3, the China deal. In January 2026, the Prime Minister flew to Beijing, first Canadian leader to visit in 9 years. He walked into the Great Hall of the People and signed a preliminary agreement that slashed Chinese tariffs on Canadian electric vehicles from 100% to 6.1%. In exchange, China reopened a $4 billion canola market, eliminated tariffs on lobster, crab, peas, and canola meal, and accelerated the resumption of Canadian beef and pet food exports. Saskatchewan, the largest canola-producing province in Canada, had been devastated. When China imposed 100% tariffs on canola oil and meal and 75% on canola seed in 2024, exports collapsed. More than 2 million tons of canola disappeared from the market. Farmers had no buyers. Prices crashed. Rural communities that depend on canola, communities where the crop is not just an export but an identity, faced the worst season in a decade. The deal reopened that market overnight. Canola futures surged. Managed money traders who had bet against the market, holding net short positions of nearly 2 million tons, were caught on the wrong side. The buyback sent prices climbing. Saskatchewan's premier, who had joined the Beijing delegation, called it a very positive day. The deal included a cap of 49,000 Chinese vehicles per year at the reduced tariff, less than 3% of the Canadian auto market. By 2030, 50% of those vehicles must be priced under 35,000 Canadian dollars, meaning affordable EVs for Canadian families. Trade lawyers pointed out that the cap of 49,000 would likely never be reached. Cold climate battery limitations, charging infrastructure gaps, and consumer preference for familiar brands all constrained demand. In 2023, Canada imported 38,000 Chinese vehicles at the peak. In 2024, that fell to 25,000. And in the years before that, imports averaged fewer than 5,000. The deal gave Canada agricultural access worth $7 billion, while conceding almost nothing on vehicles. Multiple trade lawyers confirmed that Canada did not violate CUSMA. This was not a free trade agreement. It was a targeted tariff adjustment on specific goods, legal under international trade law. One University of Calgary trade expert said Americans wanted Canadians to believe they had broken the agreement, so Canada could be punished ahead of the CUSMA review. He said none of that was true. Within 24 hours, the president threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports. The same deal he had initially praised, calling it what the Prime Minister should be doing, suddenly became a national security threat. The reversal was not about trade, it was about control. Move 4, the British deal. 2 weeks after the China agreement, the British Prime Minister flew to Beijing, first visit in 8 years. He brought 50 business representatives. He signed £2.2 billion in export deals, $2.3 billion in market access, and hundreds of millions in Chinese investment. 12 intergovernmental cooperation documents. Visa-free travel for British citizens. And London explicitly said the trip was in the national interest, regardless of how Washington might react. Canada had opened the door, Britain walked through it, and suddenly the narrative changed. The question was no longer why is Canada making deals with China? The question became why is everyone making deals with China? And the answer was the same every time, because the United States was not offering an alternative. Move 5, the House revolt. On February 11th, 2026, the Republican-led House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to terminate the national emergency declaration that authorized the Canada tariffs. 6 Republicans crossed the aisle. 3 of them voted the night before to block the Speaker's attempt to prevent the vote from happening at all. The Speaker had engineered a procedural rule change to bar tariff challenges through July, buying time for the Supreme Court to rule. 3 Republicans killed it on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday, 6 had crossed. The president posted a thread on social media during the vote. Any Republican who votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries. It did not matter. The vote was already happening. One Nebraska Republican, who was retiring and had nothing to lose, said the president's own team had offered sweeteners to flip his vote. He said the offer was for his state. And he replied, "What about the other 49? He told reporters that he estimated 30 Republicans wanted to cross but were afraid. Only 6 found the courage. But 6 was enough. The resolution now moves to the Senate, where it cannot be filibustered and requires only a simple majority. The Senate has already passed similar resolutions twice, in April and October of last year, with 4 Republicans joining all Democrats. The 4 Republican senators who voted against the tariffs last year were Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. McConnell, the longest-serving Senate leader in American history, has been a quiet but consistent critic of the tariff approach. Paul has called the tariffs unconstitutional from day one. Collins represents a border state where Canadian trade supports thousands of jobs, and Murkowski represents Alaska, a state connected to the outside world only through Canadian territory. The math in the Senate favors passage. The question is not whether the resolution passes. The question is whether it passes with a veto-proof majority, 2/3 of both chambers. That threshold has not been reached, which means the president can veto the resolution and the tariffs remain in place, at least until the Supreme Court rules. But the political damage is done. A president whose own party voted against his signature economic policy, twice in the Senate, now once in the House, enters the midterm season with his trade agenda under attack from 3 directions simultaneously: Congress, the courts, and the country he targeted. And this time, the political ground has shifted further. 60% of Americans disapprove of the tariffs. 33% of Republicans want the courts to limit tariff authority. And the CBO just confirmed that 90% of tariff costs are being passed directly to consumers. Every American household is paying an estimated $1,200 a year more because of these tariffs. And the midterm elections are 9 months away. Move 6, the legal offensive. While Canada was building trade alternatives and Congress was fracturing, the courts were closing in. The Court of International Trade ruled the IEEPA tariffs illegal in May 2025. The Federal Circuit upheld that ruling. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5th. During those arguments, justices pressed the administration to provide a single example in any statute where the word regulate means tax. The administration could not provide one. The major questions: doctrine, the principle that Congress must speak clearly when delegating power over issues of vast economic significance, hung over the entire proceeding. It has now been 104 days since oral arguments. The justices return from recess on February 20th, 3 days from now. The ruling could come at any time after that. $133 billion in potential refunds. The government has already stipulated that it will not challenge the court's authority to order reliquidation, meaning if the tariffs are struck down, the refund mechanism is already in place. Companies have filed hundreds of protective lawsuits. The customs bond market has exploded. And the trade representative went on CNBC and called the stakes enormous, then added that the challengers do not have an open and shut case. Legal analysts interpreted that statement 2 ways. Either the government genuinely believes the court will rule in its favor, or it is preparing the public for a loss. Move 7, the Gordie Howe Bridge. On February 8th, just 3 days before the House vote, the president threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is a $6 billion bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor, the single busiest international commercial crossing in North America. The president cited Canada's China deal and claimed the contract was one-sided because Canada collects the toll revenue. Canada collects the toll revenue because Canada paid for the bridge, the entire $6 billion. This was not American infrastructure that Canada was profiting from. This was Canadian infrastructure connecting 2 economies, built with Canadian taxpayer money, that the president now threatened to block because Canada exercised its sovereign right to trade with other nations. The threat to block its opening, which would directly harm Michigan auto workers and manufacturers, landed in the middle of a swing state that the party cannot afford to lose. Michigan has already seen lumber prices rise, fuel costs increase, and manufacturing supply chains disrupted. The auto industry, which depends on parts crossing the border between Detroit and Windsor multiple times during assembly, is operating under constant uncertainty. One automotive executive told reporters that planning is impossible when the rules change every week, and it demonstrated something that even sympathetic observers found difficult to defend. The tariff policy was no longer about trade, it was about punishment. And the country being punished was the closest ally, the largest trading partner, and the single largest buyer of American goods on Earth, $700 billion in annual bilateral trade. Integrated supply chains, auto parts crossing the border 6 or 7 times before a car is finished, Canadian oil powering American refineries, Canadian lumber building American homes, Canadian electricity lighting American cities, and all of it, every dollar, every shipment, every job connected to that trade, held hostage to a policy that 2 courts have ruled illegal, that a majority of Americans oppose, and that the president's own party is beginning to abandon. The CUSMA review begins July 1st, 5 months away. And here is the part of this story that most people do not know. In October 2025, trade negotiations between the 2 countries were progressing. Both sides had appointed teams. Both sides were exchanging proposals. And then the Premier of Ontario, Canada's most populous province, published a public service announcement. It featured audio clips of former President Ronald Reagan, a Republican icon, stating that tariffs on foreign goods are poor policy in the long term. Reagan's own words, used by a Canadian provincial leader in a public advertisement. The president saw it and canceled all trade negotiations with Canada. Not the tariff, not a specific proposal, all negotiations. He said he would raise tariffs on Canada by more than 10% in response to the advertisement. An advertisement quoting his own party's most celebrated leader. The cancellation meant that the window for negotiating a framework ahead of the July CUSMA review closed. 6 months of potential preparation? Gone, because of a public service announcement. That decision, made in anger, implemented without strategic calculation, gave Canada time. Time to deepen the China relationship. Time to sign the British deal. Time to let the legal challenge work its way to the Supreme Court. Time to let congressional pressure build. And time to demonstrate to every trading partner on Earth that the United States was not a reliable negotiating counterpart. 12 months ago, the United States could have walked into that review and dictated terms. Canada had no leverage, no alternatives, no bargaining position. That is no longer true. Canada now has a functioning trade agreement with China worth $7 billion in agricultural market access. It has deepened relationships with the EU, India, ASEAN, and Mercosur. It has a buy Canadian policy, redirecting billions away from American suppliers. It has demonstrated that it can survive without the United States. Not thrive, but survive. And survival is all you need to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. 75% of Canadian exports still go south. But the psychology has changed. The dependent partner has demonstrated options. And when the dependent partner demonstrates options, the dominant partner can no longer assume compliance. For decades, the assumption was that Canada would always come to the table, accept the terms, and sign the deal, because there was nowhere else to go. The Prime Minister proved that assumption wrong. And now, every middle power in the world, Australia, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, India, is asking the same question. If Canada can do it, can we? The answer, increasingly, is yes. And that is why this story is not about Canada. It is about the end of an era in which a single country could use economic force against its allies and expect compliance. Here's what this means for you, wherever you're watching from. If you are American, you are paying for this policy right now. The CBO confirmed that 90% of tariff costs are passed directly to consumers. That means the tariffs are not a tax on Canada. They are a tax on Americans who buy Canadian goods, which is almost everyone. Canadian lumber builds American homes. Canadian oil powers American refineries. Canadian auto parts are inside American cars. Canadian electricity lights American border states. When those goods cost 25 or 35 or 45% more, the price does not stay at the border. It flows through the entire supply chain, into your mortgage, your gas tank, your grocery bill, your heating bill. The Joint Economic Committee estimated $1,200 per household per year, and that was before the latest escalation. If you are Canadian, you are living through the most significant economic restructuring of your country in a generation. The trade diversification is real but incomplete. 75% of exports still go south. The China deal, the EU negotiations, the India talks, they are building alternatives, not replacements. And the CUSMA review in July will determine whether the foundation of the bilateral relationship survives or collapses. If you are anywhere else in the world, you are watching a template. Canada showed that a middle power with patience and strategy can resist the economic coercion of a superpower, not by matching force with force, but by building options, deepening relationships with other partners, using legal channels, and waiting for the superpower's own political system to create pressure from within. The 6 Republicans who crossed the aisle did not do it because Canada asked them to. They did it because their constituents were hurting, because lumber prices were up, because fuel costs were up, because the businesses in their districts were losing Canadian contracts. Canada did not need to lobby Congress. The tariffs lobbied Congress for them. That is the elegance of the strategy. And that is why the world is watching. The tariffs are under legal challenge. The congressional support is crumbling. The diplomatic isolation is deepening. And the country that was supposed to be the easiest target turned out to be the one that showed the world how to push back. Not with force, with patience, with strategy. And with the quiet confidence of a nation that refused to accept old terms when new options were available. One final detail that tells you how deep the transformation goes. Alberta, Canada's most pro-American province, the oil heartland, the one place where you might expect sympathy for Washington, saw its premier pledge to hold a referendum on Albertan separatism in 2026 if enough voters sign a petition. Not separation from the United States, separation from Canada. Because even within Canada, the trade war has reshuffled loyalties and created fractures that did not exist before. That is the depth of what has changed. The tariffs were supposed to discipline a dependent neighbor. Instead, they radicalized an entire country and gave every other middle power on earth a playbook for how to respond. To stay ahead of every move in this story, the Supreme Court ruling, the CUSMA review, the midterm elections, and the trade deals being signed right now, make sure you are following this channel, because this is not over. It is accelerating.